Well, good morning and welcome to Dublin. And I suppose I'm continuing the hues and shades that Reginald and his colleagues spoke about Fiona. So have I got the first slide? I have, yes. So I want to introduce you to this young couple who had their wedding celebrations in this very hotel in 1980, a long time ago. It was me with my new wife 44 years ago, and we're still going strong. In the Ireland of the 1980s, I could not have expected to ever deliver a welcome address to such a conference as this one of yours. No one could. As Janie says in the conference booklet, in Ireland we have unusual sources of pride in our nation of talkers and storytellers. One is that we do death well. Stories tend to become our identities, according to the psychologist Jonathan Adler. You tell the story first, then you live your way into it, he says. In 2011, I did a photographic exhibition of GPs and family doctors at work, which was exhibited at various public places around Ireland. I also offer the doctors an opportunity to have a picture taken in the location of their choice. Here is the picture of Dr. Kevin Quinn from Arrowmore Island, which is in the northwest coast of Ireland, and he chose the local cemetery. He seems lost in reverie as he remembers the countless numbers of his deceased patients in their final resting place. He told me afterwards, on this island, the past is never past. We have a go-to website to find out who has died recently and when and where their funeral is taking place. It's called rip.ie. It was sold recently, and I was astonished to see that it has 60 million hits a month. And remember, there are only 5.3 million of us in the part of the island that it serves. The Irish wake still occurs and is well portrayed by the writer, war correspondent and filmmaker Kevin Toulis in his 2017 account of his father's wake in this book called My Father's Wake. Death is a whisper in the Anglo-Saxon world, but on a remote island off the coast of County Mayo, death has a louder voice. Like the ancient Greeks, the islanders have no fear of death. They still wake throughout the night with their dead and share in the sorrow of the bereaved. They bear the burden of the coffin on their shoulders and dig the grave with their own hands. The living and the dead remain bound together in the Irish wake, the oldest rite of humanity. And yet, most people die in hospital or in our hospices. Most of those wanted to die at home with all the comfort that familiarity brings. A good friend recently died at home following the ravages of a neurological disease. At his funeral, his daughter spent about 5 minutes recording the family's gratitude to the myriad of staff who provided comfort to him at home in his final years and months. Supporting patients' wishes to die at home is resource intensive, and death in an institution is far from ideal. So having attempted to set the scene here in Ireland, I want to tell you about the factors affecting GPs and our caring for the dying. For myself, I have been involved in every campaign that has sought to allow doctors to practice medicine in accordance with the patient's wishes. But GPs are uncertain about how to approach voluntary assisted dying, and that includes me. There are a few factors that have led us to this point. Opinion leaders in geriatrics and palliative care in Ireland have come out openly against medically assisted dying. And while we must respect their experience and ethical beliefs, it still means that we as GPs have to draw on international experience to be fully informed on what is a complex and divisive issue. Your valuable expertise is being brought to us at this conference, for which we are very grateful. I note that a third of the contributors at this conference have been or are GPs, and each of you will have a story to tell us about how you got here. In debating voluntary assisted dying, I would draw parallels with our experience here in Ireland with abortion, which has been tortuous and painful, vicious at times. After a referendum in May 2018, when 2/3 of the votes supported the introduction of abortion, we as GPs realised that it was to be us that would carry it out in our own practices on our own patients. Many GPs had not seen this coming, and one colleague told me it was easy to be liberal on this issue when we thought it was going to be the gynecologists that would do it. The gynecologists were slow to play their part, and we as GPs had to upskill ourselves largely without their help. And it has gone well, with most practices having a colleague or colleagues who signed up to do it. Because GPs took abortion off the political table so effectively, we fear a similar process will occur with voluntary assisted dying, whereby the government will expect GPs to do it. Again, a colleague asked me, "You don't think they will land this on our doorstep, do you?" He's not against it, but he is aware of the level of upskilling and commitment involved. This is a key factor to consider in any debate on voluntary assisted dying. COVID was a baleful time for many in the world, particularly the Western world. Many people died alone without the support of loved ones, and this picture captures it well. It traumatized relatives, and many have told me of their grief at not being present at the death or the funeral, which has had psychological effects and also a cultural rupture here in Ireland. It has changed their attitudes to death, and our planned governmental review of our COVID response will hopefully examine the psychological and cultural trauma of dying alone. One thing I do know is that relatives don't ever want to experience again the lonely suffering their loved ones endured, and which ended with the priest, funeral undertaker, and a couple of relatives, as in this picture, where hundreds would normally be expected. Again, going back to the interminable abortion debates we had in Ireland over 4 referenda since 1987, we discovered that as a nation, we find it difficult to disagree agreeably. We seem to take up positions with a vehemence and relish that leaves little room for manoeuvre. We now have a more liberal abortion regime than if negotiation took place, as the arguments against it ceded no ground. It would sadden me to see overly entrenched views again becoming a feature of the voluntary assisted dying debate. I believe that we must take a pragmatic approach if we are to tackle the thorny issue of legislation on voluntary assisted dying. Any legislation enacted must, of course, include an opt-out for those doctors with conscientious objections. I would hope, however, that we can have a rational debate and avoid another culture war when it comes to considering voluntary assisted dying legislation. The Irish College of GPs is a membership organisation that has nearly all the country's 3,500 practising GPs as members. We are pragmatic folk. women and men of the world who know our priorities and who know our patients and whose patients know us. The College has produced a discussion paper on voluntary assisted dying, which is non-directional in its approach, being neither for nor against. Most members are like me, conflicted, but see its merits in a small number of cases, but many, like my colleague, hope it doesn't land on their doorstep. But there is another layer to this issue. Because most people die in institutions, we as a group have remarkably little experience of death and dying. This lack of experience surely affects our attitudes to death in all its forms. The supports needed by the dying are aggregated in hospitals and hospices and are available to us as outreach services in the case of the hospices. My friend who died at home had his wishes respected because he was clear about them and had good medical connections. As GPs, we know full well that we should respond to patients' wishes to die at home. It is an enormous commitment that requires education and a reorientation of resources. It is in this commitment that I think the main source of our reservation lies. Because we, as GPs, have so much more to do nowadays, I doubt if I would now be able to make such commitments to patients. Easing suffering is a noble part of my profession that we seem to have let go, and everyone, especially patients, is all the worse for it. It's as if the important has been sacrificed to the incessant demand of a querulous nation. I do hope that the debates we will inevitably have about voluntary assisted dying will include the patient's voice and their wish to die at home, and that it will include community-based resources rather than the current outreach services that we allow GPs to provide true cradle-to-grave care. In my final substantial comment about voluntary assisted dying, it can come across as a technical and lonely process for those courageous and organised enough to go through with it. I've seen religious and secular services here in Ireland reorient themselves towards a celebration of the deceased's life. Surely the courage of a patient who wants to end their suffering should be marked in a special way. Don't believe the media who tell you that Ireland has become a godless place in the last 30 years. We might have eschewed organised religion, but we still have a deep vein of spirituality that wants to make sense of life and death, even to transcend the cares and trials of the everyday. I think we will need to borrow from the tradition of wakes, religion, spirituality, artists and poets to create a celebration for patients who choose voluntary assisted dying after suffering a long, drawn-out, painful illness with no meaning. Tullus draws on the Iliad when he says, "Without proper funeral rites, the unquiet dead remain stranded, disordering the lives of the living." Finally, I wish you well in your work at this conference and in the awesome responsibilities you have taken on. Thank you very much.